Big financial news out of the US this morning. The Federal Reserve delivered its biggest interest rate hike in almost 3 decades after confirming a 0.75% rise. Joining me now is the Australian's Washington correspondent, Adam Creighton. Adam, your thoughts on this?
Well, Pete, look, certainly this was expected, or it was factored into market pricing before it happened. But certainly, it's fascinating. It has happened, as you say. Almost 30 years have gone by before this has occurred. We just have to wait and see now what it does to the rate of inflation, which is already almost 9% in the US, so far more than in Australia. And at the same time as you've got the 9% inflation, you've got a shrinking economy here in the first quarter of the year. And most senior economists now expect the US economy to tip into recession shortly, which will mean that you'll essentially have some sort of stagflation process, which is the last thing anyone wants.
Okay, so to make things simple for people out there to understand, are we going to have the similar things that we're seeing in Australia now that will happen in the US? People will struggle to pay their mortgages, items will continue to get more expensive, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, look, I would say so, because both countries essentially followed a similar response to the pandemic. They shut things down, they printed a lot of money, they handed the money out, and of course now both countries are paying the consequences of that. So yes, I do expect Australia's 6 months to 12 months behind the US. I think in Australia inflation is going to rise just as it has in the US. And the Reserve Bank is going to have to follow what the Federal Reserve's doing. I mean, certainly if you look back over 20, 30 years, there's a strong correlation with what happens to interest rates in the US and what happens with interest rates in Australia. So, so I think it's bad news, essentially, for anyone with a mortgage, essentially a variable rate mortgage.
So did Jerome Powell undercook his response in the same way that many people suggest that Governor Phil Lowe did here?
Well, look, of course, he tried to put a positive spin on it. The Fed has said the US economy is going to grow this year by 1.7%. But, I thought that was rather funny, because just a few hours earlier, one of the branches of the Federal Reserve, it has about 12 branches, and the Atlanta branch does a forecast of GDP growth, and they released their forecast for the second quarter, and it was 0. So if that's true, the US is already in a recession, and certainly it's not going to grow by 1.7%. This year. So, I mean, central banks always have to put a positive spin on things, but it's pretty grim times for them.
Sure. All right, Adam Creighton, good to see you. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks for joining us.
Likewise, Pete.